When discussions about Woodrow Wilson come up, they usually focus on his foreign policies, social issues, or violations of civil liberties. No 21st century discussion would be complete without mentioning his resegregation of the federal government and premiering the birth of a nation at the White House, or arresting a bunch of opponents of American entry into World War I. Those are all very important, but what tends to get ignored are his economic policies, especially after the US enters the Great War. And this is where I explain the title of the video. You see, during the latter half of the Wilson presidency, his administration was given so much power and control over the economy that one member of his administration described it as an industrial dictatorship, and on paper at least, it was functionally indistinguishable from socialism. And by socialism, I am referring to the state control of natural resources and the means of production. It was the kind of power that the US government is only capable of achieving during a time of war, and has never achieved since, but not for lack of trying. Okay, so if I'm going to tell you this story of America's brief flirtation with socialism, I should probably give you some context. When you read books about Woodrow Wilson, they'll usually describe him as a kind of laissez-faire liberal, but I have no idea where anybody's actually getting this idea from. Based on his writings and what he actually did while in office, this just isn't the case. Some might justify this claim by saying he was a laissez-faire liberal before entering into office, but that's also not true, as you can discern from his writings. Of particular interest to this point is an essay Wilson wrote on socialism back in 1887.
It is easy to make socialism, as theoretically developed by the greater and saner socialist writers, intelligible not only, but even attractive as a conception. It is easy also to render it a thing of fear to timorous minds, and to make many signs of the times bear menace of it. The only hard task is to give it validity and strength as a program in practical politics. Yet the whole interest of socialism extends beyond the covers of books and the paragraphs of periodicals, lies in what it will mean in practice. It is a question of practical politics, or else it is only a thesis for engaging discourse.
Wilson was an academic, and is often praised as the father of administrative studies. But when you read his writings, you find that more and more of it is focused on giving more and more power to technocratic experts in government, including over economic affairs.
State socialism is willing to act through state authority as it is at present organized. It proposes that all ideas of a limitation of public authority by individual rights be put out of view, and that the state consider itself bound to stop only at what is unwise or futile in its universal superintendence alike of individual and public interests. The thesis of the state socialist is that no line can be drawn between private and public affairs which the state may not cross at will. That omnipotence of legislation is the first postulate of all just political theory. For it is very clear that in fundamental theory, socialism and democracy are almost, if not quite, one and the same. They both rest at bottom upon the absolute right of the community to determine its own destiny and that of its members. Men as communities are supreme over men as individuals. Limits of wisdom and convenience to the public control there may be. Limits of principle there are, upon strict analysis, none.
This sentiment against a laissez-faire market continued throughout his presidential campaign, constantly speaking about the evils and corruptions of corporations, and during his presidency he ramped up antitrust suits against them. The only difference between his suits and those of Roosevelt and Taft is that his administration began losing more of them. After World War I broke out in Europe, there was a demand from the belligerent powers for arms, foods, and other goods. This sudden increase in demand for war materials helped bring the US out of recession. This is the picture we are generally left with for the American economy before the US entry into World War I. The US was making weapons and selling them to both sides, thereby becoming rich. Well, that's not exactly what happened. Britain and France definitely bought a lot of US-made arms, but the Central Powers didn't, considering they would have to be delivered by boat across the Atlantic Ocean, which was controlled by the Royal Navy. On top of that, there were many American investors buying bonds in Britain and France, so the US was never truly neutral. This is the picture most histories leave us with after the US entered the war in April of 1917. But what happened after that, though? The democratically controlled Congress passed a large number of laws granting the executive branch more and more power over manufacturing, transportation, and the use of goods. In July of 1917, the War Industries Board was created. It was intended to serve mostly as an agency to help coordinate the purchases of goods between the Army and the Navy. However, it would soon extend far beyond that. It took control by setting production quotas for factories and taking control of the allocation of natural resources. It also attempted to manage the hiring process for these private companies, putting workers where the board believed they were best suited, based on psychological testing. And by the way, these were early 20th century psychological tests. Considering how bad modern ones are often considered to be, can you imagine how much worse those ones were? The WIB also controlled the wages of workers and dealt with all disputes between labor groups and the companies by siding with the workers and giving them basically whatever they wanted. Woodrow Wilson brought on Wall Street investor Bernard Baruch to head the WIB, and he became one of its first historians, and propagated a myth that the board was responsible for increased industrial output during the war. There is no evidence then that the policies introduced by Baruch as head of the War Industries Board, and the policies being introduced by the Food Administration, Fuel Administration, and other agencies, significantly increased the flow of materials into the war effort. The federal government nationalized the railroads in January of 1918 so that they could monopolize the movement of war materials, but this created its own set of problems. How would they prioritize what got moved around first? In a normal market economy, priority would be given to those willing to pay more. However, in this situation, that signal was taken out of the equation. They let individual departments decide how important their shipments were. So what do you think happened? It's something that the National Bureau of Economic Research calls priorities inflation. Basically, every contractor, manager, and bureaucrat determined that their shipment was of the utmost importance and therefore gave it the highest priority ranking, which resulted in lots of confusion and backup in the transportation system. With prices for steel fixed and the order books filled, producers faced intense pressure because each agency booking an order, the most important were the Army, the Navy, the Railroad Administration, and the War Shipping Board, wanted their orders filled first. Funneling all contracts through the War Industries Board and having the War Industries Board set the priority for each contract solve industry's problem. If someone from one of the major claimant agencies wanted to know why a particular order was not being filled, the answer would be, go see the War Industries Board. It wasn't just the railroads that were nationalized. The Wilson administration also nationalized water systems, shipbuilding facilities, radio stations, along with the telegraph and telephone industries. On top of this, there were also prohibitions on certain exports, as well as rationing and price controls for both military and consumer goods. And you want to know what else is being controlled? Whether or not this video gets a mid-roll. And just in case YouTube is as incompetent of getting this video a mid-roll ad as the Wilson administration was in Central Economic Planning, then I would like to take this time to encourage you guys to click that like button and to share the video. It's the easiest way in order to help this channel grow. But for now, let's get back to the video. If all of this doesn't sound like much, just remember that this was on top of everything else going on, such as higher taxes and conscription, of which, by the way, men at that time could make more money in the private sector than they could serving in the military. But even worse than that, conscripts made less in the military than volunteers did. There were also the Alien Enemies and Espionage Acts, which arrested thousands of Americans who opposed the war. On top of this, the Wilson administration had anyone born in Germany put into internment camps, and enabled violent harassment of anyone of German heritage. Many began to hide their ethnic identity by not speaking German and quitting their involvement in German-American organizations. It also pushed Lutheran churches into abandoning the use of German in their liturgies, which I brought up in my History of Lutherans in America video. And none of this includes the actual fighting of the war itself. And so when you put all of this together in context, you could probably call Woodrow Wilson a dictator with both nationalist and socialist proclivities. Okay, so things are looking pretty bad in 1918, so what happened? Well, democracy did. The 1918 midterm election saw the first wave of an American backlash against progressivism, with both the Senate and the House switching over to Republican control. Seeing the writing on the wall, President Wilson signed an executive order decommissioning the War Industries Board on January 1st, 1919. None of the policies put in place during the war had any kind of sunsets in them. There was no date or condition under which the laws would self-terminate. The rest of Wilson's war socialism had to be dismantled by the Republican-controlled Congress, creating a landing zone for Warren Harding and the return to normalcy. The relatively small increases in spending resulting from the war, and few institutional legacies, with the exception of the shipping administration and prohibition, were the result of determined efforts by conservative administrations in the 1920s to scale back taxes and spending, and to end regulatory experiments. The war economy had, at least in the short run, soured the public on the Democrats. The war socialism of the Wilson administration would have a long shadow. Many of the same people who were part of the War Industries Board would go on to serve and advise future Democratic presidents. This concept, even if not under this name, has been a driving force within the Democratic Party ever since, which in numerous ways is still the party of Wilson. The perceived success of government intervention in the economy during the war, whether real or simply the halo effect of victory around a brief and confused experiment, increased the confidence on the left that central planning was the best way to meet a national crisis, certainly in wartime, and possibly in peacetime as well. This view was far from being dominant during the 1920s, but it made itself felt when the Great Depression brought the Democrats back to power in the 1930s. It seems likely, therefore, that the speed and scope of the federal government's expansion in the 1930s were greater than they otherwise would have been because of the impact of World War I on the ideology of the nation's economic and political leaders. And it was the reforming liberalism of the 1930s that inspired future generations of would-be reformers. For America, to sum up, the most important long-run impact of the war may have been in the realm of ideas. Wilson was a progressive not only before his presidency, but also through it. Self-identified progressives might take umbrage with this notion due to his views on race, but what needs to be understood is that progressivism wasn't just one thing. The progressive movement was a big tent that contained both civil rights activists and eugenicists, nationalists and socialists, technocrats and populists. It was a movement defined more by a belief that government can and should be an active force in reforming society than it was by the implementation of any particular policy. And it just so happened that Woodrow Wilson happened to be at the more technocratic corner of that tent. Wilson was the first professional academic at a time when the professionalization of social science was considered a cornerstone of human progress. He was both a practitioner and a priest of the cult of expertise. The notion that human society was just another facet of the natural world and could be mastered by the application of the scientific method. War socialism under Wilson was an entirely progressive project, and long after the war it remained the liberal ideal. To this day, liberals instinctively and automatically see war as an excuse to expand government control over vast swaths of the economy. Many of the historians who describe Woodrow Wilson as a laissez-faire liberal are left-wing ones, and essentially they're trying to make Woodrow Wilson sound like a modern conservative. And it's understandable why they would want to do this. It's the same reason we see political activists and commentators playing hot potato with Hitler. Neither side wants to be stuck holding it. As the centenaries of World War I have come and gone, we have been forced to readdress the legacies of that time. And Wilson is one that more and more people are coming to regret. But why should we play hot potato with Woodrow Wilson when we can just let that potato hit the ground? Everybody has something to hate about Woodrow Wilson. Liberals, conservatives, progressives, libertarians, socialists, and capitalists. Woodrow Wilson is an equal opportunity punching bag. And I think that's a tune we can all dance to. I'm going to end this foray into Woodrow Wilson with a quote from Liberal Fascism by Jonah Goldberg, the self-described pseudo-intellectual demi-Jew from the Upper West Side. In America, we have chosen not to discuss the madness our republic endured at Wilson's hands, even though we live with the consequences of it to this day. Like a family that pretends that the father never drank too much and that the mother never had a nervous breakdown, we moved on as though it were all a bad dream we don't really remember, even as we carry around the baggage of that dysfunction to this day. So what do you guys think? Was the United States technically a socialist state between 1917 and 1919? Let me know your thoughts down in the comments below. I checked my analytics recently and it said that over 90% of the people who watch my videos aren't subscribed to the channel. If those people who watch my videos but don't subscribe to the channel did so, that would nearly double the size of the channel, which of course would help it grow even further. So if you enjoyed this video, I would encourage you to subscribe and to click that bell icon to turn on notifications to make sure you do not miss a new video when they come up. You could also like the video and follow me on Twitter to make sure that you see these videos, because we never know when YouTube is going to decide to not work. I would also like to thank my patrons over at patreon.com/casualhistorian. Your generous support in these difficult times allows me to keep making these videos. Thank you. If you're looking for more content to watch, then you can watch my latest video right here, or you can watch the Cynical Historian's videos about Woodrow Wilson right here. Thanks for watching, and I will see you next time.
Wilson!